Shalom, ni hao. English will follow, but I'll start with Hebrew. שלום לכולם. פרק היום אני מארח את פרופסור קריס מילר, שכתב את הספר המשובח הזה, מלחמות השבבים, שיצא לקרוא אותו גם באנגלית, ואז החבר'ה נהדרים בסלע מאיר שלחו לי גם גרסה עברית שלו, קראתי אותו שוב, נהניתי באותה מידה, ועקיבא לם היקר חיבר אותי לקריס מילר, בשביל לדבר על הספר הזה, שהחשיבות שלו לדעתי רק הולכת וגדלה, באמת מהספרים שלדעתי כולם צריכים לקרוא בעולם הזה של מלחמות סחר ותחרות טכנולוגית, והחשיבות האדירה של השבבים. זה מתקשר כמובן גם לחדשות האחרונות, אם זה התרגיל הסיני סביב טיואן, או המכסים של טראמפ, איך הם משפיעים על שרשראות אספקה ועל הובלה טכנולוגית. דיברנו על כל הדבר הזה, היה מרתק. פרופסור קריס מילר הוא היסטוריון, כלכלי, עשה את הדוקטורט בייל, היום באוניברסיטת ת"ף, ובאמת הספר שהוא כתב, לדעתי, אחד הספרים הכי חשובים של השנים האחרונות, אז הייתה לי זכות לדבר איתו, ומקווה שתהנו. So, hi everyone. In this episode, I had the privilege of hosting Professor Chris Miller, the author of the great book Chip Wars, which is only growing in its importance, especially given the events of the recent days, let it be the Chinese military exercise around Taiwan, or the so-called Liberation Day and all the tariffs that the Trump administration declared on. I had a fascinating conversation with Chris. I hope you will enjoy it as well. So here we go. So hello, ni hao, and welcome to our podcast, Professor Chris Miller. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Professor, I mentioned this also in the intro. I read your book twice, actually. Once when it just got out in English, and then later on after it was translated to Hebrew. So, reading it twice and making sure that you still feel like you have a very positive ROI is definitely an exceptional experience. So thanks for that, Chris. And I want to say, I think I heard you interview in several podcasts. I'll ask probably some questions that you've heard many times before, but for our audience, it would be very good to take it, as a blank slate. And there are also, of course, some hot topics. We're recording this, I guess, 3 days after Liberation Day, Trump's Liberation Day, and that obviously has a lot of effects that we already see, and probably many more that will come. So we'll try to address those as well. But maybe to start, your book really is one of the things that makes it such a great read, I think, is the fact that you manage to tell the story in such a compelling way that feels almost like you're reading like a Tom Clancy book or something like that. But then again, you manage to get a lot of the scientific details and technical details and the history of this really world-changing technology. So maybe let's start with the historical context, where you really describe very well how semiconductor became strategic assets. But can you point to a specific point in time where chips made the transition from just important technological components into actual critical geopolitical tools?
Well, in some ways, chips were critical geopolitical tools really from their creation, because the first chips that were produced in the late 1950s and early 1960s were intended for use in guidance computers that were used in space systems. One of the early usages of chips was in the guidance computer of the Apollo spacecraft that guided astronauts to the moon, but also in the guidance computers inside of intercontinental ballistic missile that formed the core of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. So there was always this really deep connection between national security requirements and advances in chips from the earliest days of the industry. And one of the big changes in the chip industry was not that the military aspects became less important, but that we found all sorts of consumer applications to also use chips for. And so today, the chip industry is actually oriented mostly towards the civilian side, but the national security state remains hugely focused on their own access to semiconductors, which are still used for guiding missiles, but also for espionage and signals intelligence and weapons design and many other types of purposes.
So along those lines, really, these chips that were used back in the 50s and 60s, they were obviously from very technology that seems like it's ancient times. But in many ways, a lot of the what we call now legacy chips, which of course most of those that we refer to are not as legacy as those, but still ones that are kind of ubiquitous and you can manufacture them, even here in Israel, definitely in China. These are the ones that are still used in many of the applications, including military applications, and also in pretty much everything else, that it be automotive or home appliances and so on. And on that regard, it's pretty safe to say that the cutting edge that the US now try to make sure that China doesn't have access to is not really critical for these kind of applications. So can you explain what is really the importance of the cutting edge chips and why it's so important for the US to make sure that it keeps that technological gap from China?
Yeah, no, I think you're right that if you want to operate a dishwasher or a coffee maker, you don't need the most cutting edge chips. And the reason is that cutting edge generally means a chip that is capable of undertaking lots of computation. And you need a lot
Yeah.
of computation in your smartphone or your PC because operating systems get more complicated every single year. But especially
Mhm.
today in data centers where you're running big AI systems or training big AI systems, and both the training and the deployment of AI require very, very high-end processors. And so you need the most advanced capabilities to actually undertake all this computation in an efficient manner. And if you're operating on 5-year-old or 10-year-old chips, your systems are slow and super power intensive and just can't practically be used. So the US is focused on the high end, both because that's the segment where alongside the Netherlands and Taiwan and Japan, there is a narrow group of companies and countries that do have really unique advantages, but also because these high-end chips are the ones that enable artificial intelligence systems. And as you see, the US and China both racing to produce the best AI, both countries believe that access to the best semiconductors are one of the key components you need in the AI race.
Definitely, of course that's true. I'll say that, obviously dishwashers and coffee machines, but also a lot of the like guided missiles and stuff like that don't necessarily need the cutting edge chips. But in regards to data centers, when we talk about this advantage, you mentioned speed and power consumption. So I'm wondering if, for example, if China had uh, 3 generations back, but as many chips as it wanted. In theory, it could still perform very complicated data center type of AI processing in scale. It would just mean that it would cost it much more from electricity perspective, and maybe more critically, there would be more latency in terms of the computation and things like that.
Yeah, well, maybe first of all, on your point about weapon systems, just to pick up the legacy versus advanced chip dynamics there, and then feed that into the data center question. I think it's interesting to look at more sophisticated drones as a interesting test case. So drones like
Mhm.
cars or like lots of mechanical systems, they do use lots of lower end chips, but the more autonomous you want your drone to get, just like the more autonomous you
Mhm.
want your car to get, the more high-end
Yeah.
processor you need inside. And so the way I like to think about it is not that we're using systems that increasingly rely solely on lower end chips, but that for a lot of systems, you
Mhm.
need a small number of leading edge and you need a larger number of the lagging edge to enable the capabilities that the leading edge unlock. And so you see that in cars, you see that in drones, you see that in a lot of applications. In data centers, I think you're right that there's at least a theoretical sense in which if you don't have a large number of high-end chips, you can use an even larger number of lower-end chips to produce the same computing capabilities with a couple of caveats. One is that as you expand these systems, it gets actually harder to move the data between them. And so
Hmm.
the bottlenecks in data transfer begin to build up. Second, as you mentioned, power consumption becomes a real big problem. We already see power availability be one of the key bottlenecks when it comes to building data centers right now in many countries.
Right.
And China arguably is less power constrained than most countries.
Hmm.
And I think
Especially
if it,
when you look at their plans for the future with
yep,
nuclear capabilities and so on.
for sure.
But yeah, it's not enough to offset the entire equation, I guess.
I think that's probably right. And there's uncertainties here as to how exactly efficiency develops. But I wouldn't want to be betting solely on hoping that I could string together enough lower end chips as the strategy was
Hmm.
undergirding my artificial intelligence development.
Yeah, I think, one interesting moment from the recent months was that DeepSeek revelation, right? Where that hit everybody by surprise, although it was kind of there for quite a while, to be honest. But I think that made me look at this as kind of like an equation that actually have more than one component. It's, of course, semiconductors and their efficiency is very, very important. We talked about power. And then there is also the software or algorithmic side of things, which is basically what we saw the DeepSeek guys do, is basically get lower or closer to the lower levels of the systems and be able to actually extract more than was expected to be extracted from these machines for their specific use cases, like kind of programming them for their specific needs, including the networking bits that I guess you referred to. So I'm wondering, when we see this equation have actually a few factors, uh, do you think that there is a way for the US and its allies to kind of make sure that it keeps enough of an edge so the other factors in the component won't offset it completely?
Well, I think it's a great question. It's a hard question because modeling out how all those factors interact isn't easy. I think you're right that there's a computing chip level factor. You're right that there's an algorithmic efficiency factor. I would also say there's two other factors that matter a lot. One is the product development factor. I think one of the things that
Mhm.
people really liked about DeepSeek that now other models have started replicating is that DeepSeek would tell you what it was thinking about as it
Yeah, the
reasoned for you.
reasoning part.
And that wasn't technological. That
Yeah,
was just a product innovation that ended up being
yeah,
very clever. So I give them credit for that. I think that the fourth aspect that's really important is the business model around these, and that's something where in the short run one can say, well, China's going to fund its own AI companies, or well, DeepSeek is anyway spun out of a hedge fund, so it doesn't need to have a business model. But in the long run, if you're going to build models that are widely used, build the infrastructure behind them, you need a business model. And that's something where I think
yeah.
we're still waiting to see the business model of leading Chinese firms. I think we know what the business model of OpenAI and Anthropic are in the US. And I think ultimately business models are just as important, if not even more important than the other factors.
Yeah, of course, and also when DeepSeek came with supposedly such low API costs and so on, it turns out that they actually just can't support the demand that they had, probably because it was so low on one hand, I mean, the pricing wise, and on the other hand, even if they had a lot of chips to develop that model or distill it from other models, then it doesn't necessarily mean that it has enough chips to actually serve in that scale.
Yep, I think
So,
that's exactly right. Exactly right.
and that brings us to another point, which is really the news from the last couple of days about Trump's sweeping tariffs. That if they were solely on Chinese exports, there would of course be one way to look at it. But the fact that Trump puts these tariffs also some of the closest US allies, the ones that under the previous administration, without going into any political agenda here, but the ones that the previous administration regarded as the most important allies to counter China's technological rise. And now suddenly countries like Taiwan or Japan or countries that are really essential for this competition are maybe having, first of all, second thoughts as to how reliable the US may be as a trading partner. But more than that, it seems to me that even if we want, I mean, we as the American side of the world want more manufacturing to go back to America, this makes everything much more expensive. I mean, just to manufacture. If you want to buy the cutting edge chips from Taiwan, that would cost you more. If you want to buy fabrication equipment from Japan, that will cost you more. It means that everything would just make the US less competitive in a way. So I'm wondering if you see, if you can lay out some points where you see that this actually strengthen the US position in the semiconductor war with China and how it may unintentionally maybe undermine it.
Well, I do personally have a lot of concerns about both the global nature of the tariffs, which I think bring up a lot of the problems that you cited, as well as the immediacy. Like if you give businesses
Yeah.
time to adjust, they can adjust over time, but giving them a week to adjust is not enough. And so I think in the data center construction space, we've seen a lot of I think concern the last couple of days about trying to understand which servers, which chips, which types of cooling equipment, which types of transformers will be tariffed. And there's, I think, still substantial uncertainty in the industry as to what actually will and will not be tariffed. When you get into the tariffs on Mexico, for example, there's a lot of really complex trade law questions about what is and is not compliant as part of the U.S. Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement. So all this uncertainty is a major challenge. I think the second challenge that the tariffs have created is by creating a real sense of crisis in financial markets. And so if you want to raise money for your next AI startup, it's a lot harder now than it was 2 weeks ago. And so I think there's plenty of people in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, and in Washington asking, are there ways that at least some of these tariffs can be rolled back? Maybe not the ones on China, but the ones on other countries. The challenge seems to be that President Trump, I think, is not just using tariffs as a negotiating tool. He also sees tariffs as a good outcome in themselves. And so he's been less willing thus far, at least, to negotiate than a lot of people hoped. That might change over time. And I think he's more tolerant of seeing a substantial increase in tariffs across the board as a good outcome. And I think, I would be more skeptical of that outcome for the reasons that you articulated.
So how would you, I mean, if you're now being called to the Trump administration, say, listen, Chris, we effed it up a little bit. Can you help us fix this tariff scheme and make sure that, because I read the M&E, was it called, that big report, the 400 pages report that came before Liberation Day, and what was very obvious is, although it was alluding to a lot of problems in the global trade system, it was very clear that China is the predominant target or cause of these problems, and that China requires a more structured, strategic handling rather than just bumping up more tariffs on them. So my question is, if you were to say, okay, I read this report, I understand, here is what we need to do in a way that would actually benefit the US in this critical technological war, where I think chips is probably, if not the most important, at least at the very, very top of the list.
Well, I think when you look at the trade relationship between the U.S. and China, and also between China and much of the rest of the world, half of the trade between the U.S. and China is not in anything remotely associated with technology. It's in
Yeah.
textiles and furniture and shoes and toys. And so I would say my concerns about that half the trading relationship are pretty limited. And I would leave that mostly untouched and say it's
Yeah.
the top half of the trade spectrum where you do have intellectual property concerns, you do have market access concerns. And here I think that the challenge the US has faced has been, how do you build a coalition? Because if you just impose tariffs in China, like the US did under Trump's first term, you find that everything gets rerouted through Vietnam, and you've
Yeah.
essentially got the same products arriving at your market. And so we've seen the US actually under Trump's first term with Canada and Mexico begin to sign trade deals that said, we're going to have free trade with our friends so long as we've got the
Mhm.
same sets of requirements vis-a-vis other countries, above all China. And I think there are
Yeah.
some people in the Trump administration right now who would like to sign similar deals with Japan, with Taiwan, maybe even with countries like Vietnam, and say if you impose some restrictions on China rerouting goods through your country, which is actually probably in your own interest because you get more business as a result, we'll do free trade with you. I
Yeah.
think there was a lot of hope among some that we'd actually move in that direction, and the challenge is we moved in tariffing everyone to start. And so now the question is, can we over time get ourselves back in that type of world, or is the disruption going to be so great that we end up in a situation of tariffs on anyone? And that is the question that the tech sector is asking, just like it's the question that everyone in Washington is asking.
Yeah, yeah. With the hope that this is just a very aggressive negotiation point to start from. Let's put it this way. Okay, and we mentioned Taiwan, which is, of course, a critical factor in this for many historical reasons, but specifically on the semiconductor side, it really has a central role in the global chip manufacturing, especially in the cutting edge bit. Um, so I want to ask Chris, how do you assess the real risk of military conflict between the US and China over Taiwan semiconductor capabilities? And when I ask this, I'll just explain China's position on Taiwan has been pretty much the same even before Maurice Chang decided to establish TSMC there, and before all the industrial policy initiatives from the Taiwanese government back in the 70s, I guess it was. But right now, there is also very clear that semiconductor, even if they're not the cause of the conflict, they're definitely a centerpiece in it. And in a way, I'll say that is not just a matter of China, quote unquote, getting hold of the most advanced equipment, which I don't know if it would survive a kinetic war, but more in the ability of China to basically decide that it just bombs all the TSMC fabs to prevent the US or the Western world from getting access to these most advanced chips, and by that cutting the gap that it has at the moment.
So I think right now, and again, a lot's changing in the economic structures this week. But where we stand right now, I think both sides, the Chinese and the U.S., would lose immensely from any disruption to Taiwan's chip making capabilities. Which doesn't mean that a war is impossible, but I think it does mean that neither side would start a conflict with the aim of destroying those capabilities. It's true that the U.S. Has unique access to the high end of what TSMC produces, but China
Mhm.
still relies in its own manufacturing base on a lot of the middle and the low end of what
Yeah.
TSMC produces. And so all of the smartphones assembled in China, all of the PCs assembled in China, all of China's own manufacturing base still relies quite heavily on Taiwan. That is changing. China is building a more self-sufficient kind of supply chain, but for now, Taiwan is still absolutely critical. And so I don't I don't see a scenario in which Xi Jinping says, let's knock it out as the aim of a conflict. But I do worry that you have a conflict start, and in the process, it gets knocked out. And here I worry both about China trying to launch somewhat of a surprise operation or turn an exercise into a real war. I also worry about a sort of quarantine dynamic where China slowly tightens the screws on Taiwan, testing to see what the US and Taiwan will do in response. The US doesn't do enough in response and sends a signal to Taiwan that actually the US is no longer there to protect Taiwan, and that over a period of weeks, months, maybe even years, that sufficiently undermines US credibility such that you have a government take power in Taiwan that is pro negotiation because no other pathway seems viable and they have to cut a deal with Beijing that significantly increases Beijing's control over Taiwan. I worry about that type of scenario too, which was it would in many ways be the optimal outcome for China because you get control over Taiwan without having to cause any disruption. And I think in Washington, if you think through those scenarios, they're very tricky because the Chinese
Yeah.
salami slicing is hard to confront because any given slice of the salami seems like a small slice. and you're
Yeah.
never willing to risk substantial escalation over any given slice.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and that's the question, if will there be a situation where, even if China decides to do like a few days of quarantine just to test the waters, and how would the US respond? What if China tried to get a hold of the Kinmen Islands that are right next to its shores, or things like that? Definitely can be tricky, especially if we think about the fact that in 2014, Russia only annexed Crimea, and then 8 years later, we found ourselves in a very different situation. So I think we're all hoping for positive outcomes with that. Um, I want to ask you, Chris. I know this is not something that you specialize on specifically because we're a very small country, but I want to ask about Israel's position in this chip wars. Israel, in a way, is a pretty significant tech player, definitely compared to its size. But although we do have chip manufacturing capabilities with Tower Semiconductor, it's definitely not our strongest industry. Let's put it this way. But I'm wondering, what steps do you think Israel could take to effectively navigate or even try to capitalize on the current semiconductor tensions between the US and China?
Well, I agree that Israel is an important player, especially in comparison with its size, both in the manufacturing that you mentioned, also in chip design, where there's both a
Hmm.
pretty vibrant startup ecosystem as well as design teams from some very big US firms based in Israel. And then finally, in
Yeah.
some of the manufacturing equipment is also produced in Israel, both a couple of independent firms as well as Applied Materials, a big US firm, has a large footprint. So there's a lot of actually unique capabilities
Yeah.
that Israel's
Apple
developed.
and Google and other guys that have their centers here around that's true. On design, we're actually pretty good.
Yep.
But manufacturing, I think, is where we could improve. Let's put it this way.
I think that's yeah, I think that's right. I think I think Israel's actually had a a bit of a challenge in adjusting to the chip war because I think there was a time more so in the last couple of years than today in which Israel and the US didn't fully see eye to eye on China. That the US saw China as a real threat, and Israel saw China as a complicated partner in some ways, or at least a
Hmm.
complicated interlocutor might be a better phrase. My sense is that views in Israel have shifted somewhat over the past couple of years, both driven by internal dynamics and a better understanding of just how seriously Washington takes this issue. And there's been more alignment recently than there has in the past. But I think
Yeah.
Israel, in terms of the domestic capabilities, has a lot of the know-how that's particularly in need right now at the nexus of chip design and AI in particular. Israel is quite strong. Besides Silicon Valley, maybe a couple places in China, Israel's got one of the leading clusters of talent here. And
Yeah.
this is a place where there's a ton of need for innovation because we find that chip designs today are struggling to keep up with the demands of artificial intelligence.
Do you think that there is something that the Israeli government, or let's say as part of an industrial policy, could or should do, both on the encouraging more of the chip design capabilities, but also, I think that like the holy grail for a small country or even a middle power would probably be to find itself in the position of the Netherlands, for example, where you have a company like ASML and that's it. Now everybody needs you. If you want to create the cutting edge, you're a critical must-have part of the design chain or the production chain. So, do you think there's something that Israel could do on that regard? And is it a matter of really industrial policy, which we see now is becoming a pretty hot topic again, even in countries that really believed in just free market and all that?
Yeah, yeah. I'm far from an expert in Israeli economic policy or technology policy, so you're probably asking the wrong person for a nuanced view. I think if you look at the case of a company like ASML, what you
Yeah,
find is that it's true the Dutch government and also the European Union provided some important funding for some of the research early on, but I think
yeah.
if you were to allocate credit for ASML's success. You'd allocate a couple percentage points to the Dutch government, a couple percentage points to the
Hmm.
EU, but above 90% to ASML itself for capitalizing on
Yeah.
an extraordinary business opportunity and executing so flawlessly. And so I don't think I would look at ASML and say there's um, a great rationale for a aggressive industrial policy. Instead, I think I would actually say the opposite and say here's a great example of why you need to be economically interconnected, why you need close economic interconnections with the rest of the world. And industrial policy would be far below on my list
Yeah.
of factors that led to ASML's rise.
Probably why you don't want to tariff everybody because you need a component from
Also
Germany,
true.
the component from Japan, and so on. But yeah, okay, yeah, that's fully understood. I was stretching it a bit with your with your Israel specific knowledge, but I think what you mentioned is important because it's also general lessons, for countries that are not superpowers like the U.S. and China, and has to make sure that it makes the right choices both on government involvement and if you want to have any government involvement in these kind of things. Um, let's talk a little bit about the future, Chris. Do you see a scenario where the current chip war results in a complete technological decoupling between China and the West, or is the interdependence simply too deep?
I think for the next 5 years at least, a complete decoupling is not likely. We're headed towards a progressive decoupling, I think. Um,
Hmm.
but China is still quite reliant on both tools, chemicals, software imported from the West. And it's not going to be a short-term process of replacing them. It's already been 6 years since China was first prohibited from importing lithography tools from ASML. And in that 6 years,
Hmm.
China hasn't evidently made progress in replacing them. So I think if we say it'll take till 2030 to get close to replacing, that'd probably be a conservative estimate. But I do think China's got a strong reason and a strong set of policy tools to indigenize, got a big domestic market, which facilitates that. And so I would expect that China makes progress every year for the next couple of years on indigenization, even if it doesn't get all the way there.
Yeah, and of course, there are factors like we see now with AI where you never know where the next breakthrough might come from, an AI or an agent, rather than a team of human researchers.
For sure. For
And
sure.
it also goes the other way around, I think, Chris, or correct me if you think otherwise, but it's also that the West right now is still dependent on China for some of its critical natural resources, or let's say processed resources, and other things like, for example, the green energy revolution. If we would want to pursue it as a human race, is going to be very, very difficult to be able to get across without China in the near future. Do you think that there are things that the US and its allies, the Western world, should take at least as a safety measure if they don't mean to decouple right now in terms of their its reliance on Chinese resources or goods?
Well, I think we should be strategic in asking ourselves, what do we need to decouple from, and look at specific product categories and ask ourselves a couple of questions. I think question number one is, are we solely reliant on China, or are there multiple sources? And if there are multiple sources, then I don't worry so much about buying from China. I think number two is, if we are solely reliant, how quickly can we produce this ourselves? And in a lot of the
Yeah.
cases where we're very reliant, we could actually start a production on our own in a couple of months. And so it's not that big of a deal. And then number three is, are we reliant, maybe only partially reliant on China for supply, but that our reliance gives China the opportunity to compromise our supply chains, either for cybersecurity purposes or physical security. And I think there's been a growing recognition the last couple of years, I think catalyzed to no small extent by the Israeli operations against Hezbollah, about the extent to which supply chain security is something we really haven't thought enough about. And that doesn't mean we should worry that China is going to be blowing up our iPhones, but I think it does mean for anything that's in the critical infrastructure space used by the national security community, we've got to make sure we've got non-China supply chains for those. And the unfortunate reality today is that we don't. And that's
Yeah.
not just about semiconductors, it's about the entire electronic supply chain, where there's a lot, I think, of non-China building that needs to happen.
Yeah, we saw that both in COVID and I think even recently with supplies. I think it was for either for a battery for drones or for maybe one of the like power controllers or something along those lines. Where China decided it's not exporting it anymore, and
Yep.
there you go. You cannot make drones anymore, which is definitely a critical point. And it's also important to look a lot of times to what China is concerned about itself. Like, for example,
Hmm.
not letting Teslas getting to certain areas or certain government buildings. They probably know why they're concerned about that, and it's pretty good logic to learn some lessons from that. So speaking about lesson learned, Chris, really the book, I mean, it was an amazing undertaking really to review the entire history of this critical technology. And I think one of the point that you really lay across very well is that the Soviet Union had a structural problem because it was not really market oriented in any way, and it was always lagging behind the US, and it could not really sustain its own economy or consumer economy for semiconductors. But with China, this is not the case, and I think you illustrate that also in the book. So I want to ask you, as somebody that really researched this so thoroughly, if we look at the historical tech rivalries, let's say, what do you think are the most crucial lessons that policymakers in specific, but also in general, people should remember to avoid this kind of um, catastrophic events, or on the other hand, to keep in mind that what happened with the Soviet Union is not necessarily the same game that we're playing here with China.
I think what makes technology rivalry hard today is that in most cases, we're talking not about unique military systems like nuclear weapons were, for example. We're talking about capabilities that are widely diffused across the civilian economy, where the best capabilities are often produced by civilian companies, where the
Mhm.
processor in my iPhone is better than the processor used in almost every system the Pentagon buys.
Yeah.
And I don't even have a new iPhone. And so that dynamic makes it hard for governments to think strategically because they're operating as one player among many in a market. And success is not getting your government to be ahead of the other government. It's getting your ecosystem to be ahead of the other ecosystem. And the levers that you try to pull in that competition are very, very different than the levers you try to pull if it's a government versus government competition. When it comes to sharing intellectual property, when it comes to secrecy, when it comes to workforce, when it comes to international connections. And I think national security bureaucracies are very comfortable with the policies that you would pursue if you were developing a unique weapon system, but they're much less comfortable with the policies that you ought to pursue if you're trying to build a successful tech ecosystem. And I think that's been a challenge both for the US and for China to adjust to. And in both cases, I think you can find examples of the security focused parts of government uh, overreacting or under emphasizing the extent to which you really want your civilian ecosystem to grow first and then reap the benefits of that growth.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we see it, in space technology with SpaceX, obviously. And we also saw a couple of months ago when Xi Jinping gathered all the private sector entrepreneurs, the leaders, the main ones, basically told them, we need you guys in this, because the real question is, does he know that this is where the real innovation happens, or was it just one of those additional signals to the market that China supports the private sector and so on? And I guess the other question is, does the current administration in the US understands the importance of this factor as well, and the ability that to support the private sector, not through subsidies or anything like that, but mainly just not getting in their way in terms of being able to be competitive is very important. Um, so yeah, I definitely think this is a very good point, Chris. One last question before we wrap it up. Uh, if you look into the process of writing this great book, uh, is there something that really, because you are an economic historian, and I guess I assume that you were pretty knowledgeable about technology in general before, otherwise it would have been a very difficult gap to fill. But is there something that when you researched the book that really struck you with awe or with surprise in terms of when you started it, you really didn't think that this would be one of your key conclusions or so?
I was really surprised to see how much time I spent understanding supply chains. I had sort of heard people say supply chains are complex and important, and I always thought supply chains might be complex, but they were also boring. And it turns out that you can't understand how the world works without understanding those supply chains, both in terms of interconnections, in terms of who's actually making money in these production processes, in terms of who's got unique capabilities, who's just commoditized. And so the fascinating dynamics behind the supply chain analysis really was a surprise to me. And I think the book ended up being more supply chain focused than I would have guessed. And
Yeah.
I think I felt, and I think a lot of readers felt like the supply chain dynamics were much more interesting than they'd initially expected.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think it was very noticeable, for example, on the ASML story, where really, I think you mentioned even that I can quote you on the exact, but it's something along the lines of it's more than any specific innovation that they had, or maybe you said about TSMC, I can't remember, but it actually applies to both probably. That more than any specific innovation that they had, it's this ability to connect so many cutting edge components from different sources and making them work together and making sure that they all actually fit a grand design that is very, very, very complex and really an art form in its own right.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. In terms of let's say these strategic supply chains, do you think that the US or China, does any of them have a clear upper hand at the moment, or is it still up for grabs?
Well, I think if you look at the US advantages historically, they've been substantial. China's a newcomer in the industry. The US
Mhm.
has been at the epicenter since the first chips were invented. And so today, if you look at whether TSMC or ASML, their supply chains depend heavily on the US. But I think China does have some real advantages. The fact that Chinese firms can raise money much more easily in a lot of ways with less concern for profitability is a real advantage when you're trying to enter a market. Um, and that's why China's had a lot of success in transforming itself from a small player a decade ago to a medium-sized player today. And I think looks set to become an even larger player over the next 5 years, not necessarily catching up to the cutting edge, but becoming a bigger and bigger force in the industry.
That makes sense. So, Professor Chris Miller, I want to say thank you again for your time, for this fascinating conversation, and also for the book that you wrote, Cheap Wars, which really I can't recommend enough. I think it's one of the best and most important books I read in the last few years. So, thanks a lot for that as well.
Well,
Uh,
thank you for having
and
me.
I look forward to keep following your writings and thoughts and this never dull time that we have in front of us.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Take care.